Want to say thank you today for the Screenside Chat. We'll be talking to Nick Ducoff from Edmit. Nick, if you just want to give a quick bio and explain to people what Edmit is, just in case they don't know.
Sure, thanks, Will. Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Ducoff. As Will mentioned, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Edmit. Edmit helps students and their families make smarter college and career decisions while they're still in high school. So helping them get all the information they need up front to make better informed decisions, leading to better outcomes both after high school and ultimately after college. Prior to starting Edmit, I was the vice president for new ventures at Northeastern University, where I was responsible for corporate innovation across the institution, both in Boston as well as all of our global campuses.
Great. So a good pedigree for talking about affordability and ways that we're innovating. So, just a little bit of housekeeping here. This is being recorded, as I mentioned, for those who are here a little bit earlier. I'm going to be posting the recording of this either later this afternoon or tomorrow morning to the Enrollment Insights blog. You'll get a link to that recording, so if you want to follow up, share it with others. There'll also be shared in podcast form, so if you want to be able to listen or share it out that way. And then any additional insights we have, we'll make sure to get those in as well. So let's just jump right in. First question here. What are you seeing in terms of user behavior changes on Edmit over the past year? It's been a very stressful time for families. Are there any trends that can help enrollment professionals prepare and serve families?
Yeah, so a few things. So looking at the National Student Clearinghouse data, that indicated student applications were down 13% last year. ECMC has done some preliminary surveys that indicate they may be down similarly. However, new Student Clearinghouse data, which I actually just saw this morning, seems to indicate a decrease of just 7% this year. However, that only accounts for 14% of high schools that have responded to their preliminary research. And I saw also recently that only 2 in 5 graduating high school seniors have applied for FAFSA. That's not tremendously lower than in prior years, but it is a little bit lower. And so when you look at all those things, I think we can expect numbers to be a little bit lower this year, but perhaps not as bad as many had expected, which is great for colleges. And then with respect to what we're seeing with respect to user data, obviously this is another test optional year, and students I think are really truly settling into that and taking advantage of that. The Common App has reported that only 44% of applicants have submitted test score data, and our data at Edmit shows something very similar. Only about a quarter of our students have submitted test score data. So they may be trying to understand, okay, if I don't submit the data, what is my expected net price going to be? How is that going to be affected? They may do some, kind of scenario planning to see, okay, well, if it was this, what would it be? If it was that, what would it be? And then with respect to how test scores affect which colleges students are applying to, if you read the newspaper, you certainly know that Ivy League seemed to be the big winner with respect to test optional. And our data shows that accounts with at least one Ivy League school on their list are up 60% this year.
Wow. Wow. Do you think how much of that is the students think it's easier now that they don't have to submit a test score? We know that's not the case.
I think that's a big component for sure.
Yeah, there's going to be some real conversations around all this. Will be interesting to see how everything shakes out. So, next up here, this is the big question always is how do we innovate? And I think this goes back to sort of your background. What are some really innovative things that colleges are doing? How are they adapting either aid policies or maybe just outreach and communications in general to address the concerns that students and parents have over the past year?
Yeah, so I think there are three, kind of buckets of different types of innovation that I'll talk about. I'm sure I'm missing many, so I'd also love to hear from the 100 or so folks that have joined us today about what they're seeing. You've got folks like Grove City College, and Will, thanks for pointing me to them. There are a number like them that are providing more transparent pricing where they're saying, hey, here's our price. This is kind of like CarMax where, this is the price you pay. You're not going to haggle, you're not going to negotiate, you're not going to get any discounting, but it's a fair price, and this is how we've arrived at it. I think more transparency with respect to how that is pricing is determined is something that we're seeing more of. Then you've got schools like DePauw, that's DePauw with a W, university in Indiana, that are making promises about what happens after graduation. So their gold commitment ensures that alumni value their degree and that it maintains its value. And so you are seeing more schools make claims and statements about the value of the degree and their commitment to ensure that students have jobs and jobs that can pay off the student debt after they graduate. And then the third are, the colleges that are adopting income share agreements. Purdue's Back a Boiler program, of course, being among the first and most notable, but more and more colleges are adding those types of alternative financing options all the time.
Yeah. And one thing that I know has come up in the past is the tuition resets and these programs. Utica, I think, was the one that got the most press a number of years ago, where they dramatically lower the cost, readjust to aid. Do you think we're going to see some of that as well? And what are the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, I think that schools that have done these tuition resets have unfortunately seen that the consumer behavior doesn't change. Consumers still expect additional discounting. And that's a behavior that, thanks to folks like Ron Lieber, who recently published The Price You Pay for College, and Jeff Salingo, who gets into college and why, students and their families are becoming increasingly educated about how net price works, how merit and discounting works, that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And I think all of that affects how schools are thinking about their published price. And unfortunately, the early data from schools that have done price resets shows that those tend to not be particularly successful. Perhaps in driving more applicants, they are, but not necessarily with respect to driving net revenue.
Yeah, it'll be, I think there'll probably be a few schools that try and take that leap, right? But I don't know what they'll do. They'll do it differently. I think it's that saying that, well, it hasn't worked for anyone else, but hey, it may work for us.
Right. This time it's different.
Yes. This was a good question that came in. If you're a school that is affordable, and that can mean different things to different families, of course, but if you're affordable, but you don't want to get that association of being cheap, what are the key ways to talk about finances with students and families to help share that value?
Yeah, I think a lot of public colleges do this really well, where they will, kind of publish a matrix of how their discounting works. So, it'll say, in the pre-test optional time, it used to have like a GPA on one axis and SAT on the other axis, and kind of show you, okay, if your GPA is 4.0 and you have a 1600, here's what you can expect to pay. And if your GPA is a 3.0 and you have, a 1200, here's what you can expect to pay. There are a number of state colleges that there's legislation that requires them to be transparent about how their merit and discounting works. And I think private schools would be well advised to adopt similar practices. People want to know what they're going to pay. And the more transparency schools provide, I think the more trust they'll engender with the consumer.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's, how do you see anything in terms of the language to use? Because I think that's the thing, that if you say affordable, well, to some families that you might think of yourself as affordable and you might be affordable, but there's families that's still out of reach. Do you talk about a value? Do you talk about a good investment? Are there things you've seen there?
Well, there's a lot of research that shows Gen Z is, much more financially conservative than millennials and prior generations, in part because they grew up with seeing their parents struggle through the Great Recession, 2008 to 2010, and more recently, as teenagers, have seen, the challenges, during this past year, during the course of the pandemic. And so, the research does indicate that Gen Z responds very well to transparency, responds very well to value. And I think that that's, really what they're looking for. If you're familiar with Danny Kahneman's research around loss aversion, Gen Z, I think, really responds well to loss aversion. So if you can reduce their downside, I think that they will respond much more favorably to that than giving them, a upside. I think, for example, to say you'll earn $50,000 more than your peers. I think that's less attractive to Gen Z than saying you'll have 50,000 less debt than your peers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great way of framing it. I think, everyone wants to talk about our starting salaries, things like that. And that can be good if most of your students are coming from a local area, right? But I'm in Indiana, and so the starting salaries around here are very different than Boston or New York or LA. I think talking about it in terms of that, what you won't be losing might be a better way of framing it. Have you seen anyone doing that well?
I can't say that I have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of those
Not
where
to say,
we
not to
hope.
say it's not out there. I'm sure it
Yeah.
is, and I'd love to hear from folks on the call, but
Mm-hmm.
I haven't.
Okay. Similarly here, how can both colleges and counselors help educate students and parents about the difference between price and cost? I know this is a little bit of what you do at Edmit, even just it's that education portion too.
Yeah, one of the things we've seen over the last few years since we started Edmit is there's just been a wholesale adoption at the high school level by both individual educators as well as school leaders and districts to promote financial education, both on the personal finance side, this is like financial literacy, but also with respect to understanding college pricing and earnings outcomes and the range of those from you know, um, 2-year colleges, 4-year colleges, shorter term programs, CTE, and really helping students understand what the kind of range of options look like for them, and that there's not, that one isn't, inherently better than another.
Mm-hmm.
Taking some of, the stigma away from folks that do pursue a non-college path. And also recognizing that folks that are pursuing that college path inevitably are probably going to have to take out some amount of student debt, which is absolutely top of mind for students and families. Let me just make sure I get this right. I've got a note here. So a recent Princeton Review survey had a majority of students and parents saying that affordability and dealing with the debt burden that comes with a degree is their #1 concern with respect to where they attend college.
Yeah. Yeah, it's top of mind for everyone. It was the primary concern, and I think the past 12 months now, I guess, have made that even more so. Are there any other good pieces of advice for how we talk to students and how we make sure that they're aware of what that means, and that debt is not it's not the worst thing in the world, but having too much certainly can limit you?
Yeah, so there's kind of two parts of that. One is, the kind of price net cost. The second is kind of the debt and ROI, and whether it's that kind of big question of whether it's worth it. Is it worth it for me? With respect to the cost and net price, there are an increasing number of providers that enable students to get a better sense for what their total net price might be at a given college. Companies like Edmit, but also companies like Tuition Fit and others enable students to, begin to see what other students like them have, paid in either the same application year or prior application years.
Mm-hmm.
And those are becoming, increasingly accurate representations of what, students might expect to pay. And in many cases are more accurate than the net price calculators on the college's own websites. For many reasons, including those tend to only show financial aid and don't include any merit aid or discounting. On the question with respect to how to educate students around student debt and ROI, I've actually been writing a lot about this recently for EdSurge and Inside Higher Ed. The unfortunate reality is there really isn't a widely adopted or well understood formula for college ROI. There's a variety of different ways to kind of think about that. The rule of thumb that we typically use and how we advise students is that they shouldn't take more debt total than they expect to earn in their first year after graduating school. And that's a fairly kind of simple thing to say, don't take more debt than you're going to earn, but that's actually quite complex to calculate. So you need to basically figure out, what are you going to be able to bring to the table to pay down your tuition bills over the next 4 years? What do you even expect those tuition bills to be? What will your total gap be over those 4 years, right? What are the different interest rates you might expect to pay, right? And then on the other side of the equation with respect to earnings after college, getting program level earnings outcomes data is still something that requires a bit of finesse. Colleges recently have begun reporting at that level in the college scorecard, but the data is still pretty thin. So folks like Edmit and others who have done work to aggregate and create those data sets that can help students understand what their post-graduation earnings for a given school and major might be are helpful to at least give a student a sense of what happens to me after I graduate.
Yeah, it's putting a lot on students to be able to look at this, put it all together. I mean, if they're trying to do it on their own and they're trying to think, well, what's my earning going to be, and what's the landscape going to be in 4 years, or if they're getting graduate degrees 6 or 8 years after I graduate high school, it's just a lot. And how many high school kids sit around with amortization tables either to figure all this out of what's my monthly payment going to look like?
Yeah, well, how many parents? Probably not many more, right? I mean, it's the reality is this is complicated. They're very high search costs. This isn't something you do a whole lot, so you don't really have enough at bats to get good at it. So it really is important that we're providing the right amount of financial education so that students and their families can make well-informed decisions, because it's a big investment.
Yeah, I think the piece that it's hard to talk about, it's hard for families to calculate is, yeah, you have these earnings, but what value do you place on the softer parts of it, the qualitative pieces, the personal development, the connections you make, all these pieces that we like to talk about in admissions. What value do you place on those, or do you place a value on those? And that's where things get even muddier, I think.
For sure. I think, also from a societal perspective, I think we want to empower people to have the opportunity to be educated at college and all of the great things that come from that.
Yeah, whether that's 2-year, 4-year, career and technical, that there's a lot of value in just growing as well. In Niche's fall survey of the class of 2021, we had 92% of students report that they had fear and anxiety right now, most frequent just being that they were concerned about being able to afford the college at which they were choosing to enroll. That anxiety can easily convert over from a perceived problem of I might have problem into an actual problem. So how are you seeing colleges address that?
Well, we did see the recent Biden legislation that has a lot of money for emergency aid. And I think, thanks to work by Sarah Goldrick-Rab and others, there's an increasing spotlight on the need for emergency aid to help ensure that students that are running out of money while they're in school don't. And there's going to be a big set of money available to colleges to help support students that are unfortunately experiencing that pain. What can we do to better educate students beforehand with respect to helping them understand, to your earlier question, or maybe this is a later one. I admit I've seen the question, so apologies, but the difference between price and cost, right? And that there's a lot more to cost than there is to price, because there's a whole host of things that people need to pay for that they may not truly have thought about and set aside the money for.
Yeah. next up here in Niche's recent parent survey, they primarily reported that they were paying, or if they were helping their students, I should qualify, if they were helping their students pay for college, they primarily reported they were paying with income, savings, loans, but only 18% said they were using a 529 plan. These can be very beneficial, but why do you think there's still such a lag in the use of 529 plans? And then what can colleges, independent counselors, school counselors do to help increase adoption?
So 529 plans, I actually just did some research on 529 plans, and I learned that the average 529 plan has something in the order of magnitude of $20,000 in it. And when you think of that, you just said, less than 20%, so that's 1 out of 5, right? Have a 529 plan at all. And then the average 529 plan has $20,000 in it. Now, I don't mean to say that's not a lot of money, it sure is. But $20,000 doesn't get you that far at most colleges. We're talking maybe one semester, or perhaps at a state school, maybe a year. Very few schools where $20,000 gets you a whole year. And those are the savers, right? And those are the savers. So when the savers have, on average, just barely one semester set aside, I think that it just exposes how big this problem is of how few students are coming into college with enough income and or savings to pay for it. And this is why student debt has become such a big problem, because if you don't have the savings or income to pay the tuition bill, there's only one other choice, and that's student debt.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be a real challenge, and I wonder how many people are really starting very early on, put a little bit aside when the kids 1, 2, 3, and let that build, as opposed to, oh, it's junior year, we might need to start saving and start a plan. Yeah.
I think the data shows that folks that do have 529 plans often did start early. But there's, only a small number of people that, especially if you think about it as a young parent just getting started, with young kids, you may be in your 30s, maybe even late 20s. You got a lot of expenses. Your income, really probably isn't, certainly it's in the early growth stages. It's not at a peak at that time. And yet your expenses are probably very high. Kids are expensive. I've got 2 myself. And so there's just not that many folks that can pay their, rent, their lease, their electricity, for food, and then still have money to put in a 529 plan, in your late 20s, early 30s. That's a big ask for families that even if they are aware of 529 plans and want to do it, it's just hard to have additional money to set aside after paying everything else at that stage.
Yeah.
And by the way, they probably have their own student debt that they're paying off at that point too.
Yeah, they may. Yep. The institution I worked at before, we had a program called Walk Into My Future, where we partnered with a couple other groups and would bring in first and second graders to campus and teach them about college. And because there's just such a low number of people in the area who had attended college at all. And part of that was setting up every first and second grader with a 529 plan and putting some money in it. So getting them started early, help them out. I'm just hoping there's more programs like that nationally that get the idea in people's heads. Here's this great program. If you can set aside a little bit now, you can make a big difference in 12 years.
One of the tips that I've heard, I've thought about doing this myself, is I believe it's Fidelity. I have no relationship with Fidelity whatsoever, but I believe Fidelity has a credit card that you can link to your 529 account, and that it will take, the 1.5%, kind of cash back or whatever, and just put that right in, your kid's 529 account. And I've heard of some just tremendous success stories on Reddit of people that have, really grown their kids' 529 plans through just, spending money as they normally would, but instead of that money going, cash back or for miles or something, it goes right into the kid's 529 account, and it really can add up.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. I can say we actually do that. We have it's a rounding off that we're doing where I think it rounds up to the nearest dollar, and it adds up a lot faster than you realize. Last scheduled question here, and then we'll start. If attendees have questions, they can start dropping them in the questions tab there on the right side. But let's pull out the crystal ball. We'll put on our prognosticator hats here. Is there going to be more adoption of these true cost models? You mentioned Grove City. Some of these things, we're seeing an increase in students reporting that they're removing colleges from consideration at all based on that published cost before aid. And now it's for the first time this past fall, it was the majority of every income quintile. So even students in the top 20%, the majority of them are removing colleges from consideration.
Gosh, it's so hard to say. I think going back to my comment around Ron Lieber's Price You Pay for College and Jeff Salingo's where students get in and why, I think an increasing number of students and families are becoming educated about how college pricing works. And I think, they are becoming savvier consumers. And if you think about what happened in the automotive industry, where you used to have, the Kelley Blue Book, you used to have Consumer Reports. The Kelley Blue Book, of course, would tell you, what might the residual value of the car be, if you're going to be buying or selling it used. And then Consumer Reports telling you, is it, a good quality automobile. Fast forward to today, you've got companies like Car Gurus and TrueCar, where you don't even have to go to the dealership. They'll show you all of the recent purchases of that make and model, in your geographic area, and help find you, that vehicle at the best price they can, and tell you exactly what it's worth, exactly what recent prior years of that car have sold for. And I think that that kind of transparency is coming to higher education. And so colleges that can get ahead of that and be more transparent and build more trust with prospective students and parents about how their pricing works, what types of earnings outcomes they can expect, students, graduates' ability to repay student debt. All that data is out there in some form or fashion, but right now students and parents have to kind of, Google around to find it, or go to a website like Edmit. But I think increasingly colleges that, kind of put that front and center in their own marketing materials, and enable students, to really see it firsthand. I think that those schools will ultimately see more enrollments.
Yeah. With the transparency, would you recommend more just make it easy to find on the website, or just go heavy-handed in an email, in a print piece, whether a postcard, whatever, or all of the above?
Well, I think, there's this concept of like pre-qual, right? Hey, submit your information, whatever information, school, GPA, maybe some other information about the student with respect to what their FAFSA or EFC might be. The FAFSA forecaster used to provide, expected EFC, things like this, to enable a student to see, all right, well, if I apply here and if my grades and if everything else kind of remains the same, what can I expect? And not just in financial aid, but in financial aid and merit aid. And not only, have a number that it spits out, but perhaps even this will be your offer, provided that these things remain within these tolerances, right? If if your GPA is 3.4 right now and you maintain it, at least 3.3, we'll guarantee you this price if you apply here. Because that's essentially what TrueCar and Car Gurus do. And those companies have been tremendously successful. And I think that this is the way that consumers, want to shop, even for homes, multi-$100,000 investments. Recently, Zillow made their Zestimate, which is a price estimate for what a house might sell for in 20 regions around the country. they've now made the Zestimate a first cash offer. In other words, Zillow will buy your house for your Zestimate with one click, right? And so I think that that's how consumers are being trained to, you know, purchase and sell things on the internet, not just on Amazon for, you know, $10, household item, but for, $30,000 cars and $300,000 homes. So why not, $100,000 colleges?
Yeah, make it easy. Okay, we'll open it up here for questions, and I'll just start asking those here. For those who have a cutoff here at 1:30, just want to thank you for attending. You'll get an email with the recording here. We'll also have a link to the podcast version if you'd rather listen. But one question here, when families are being told, 100,000 in debt, things like this, how do we help reframe that? Because for an undergraduate education, that's almost nobody. That's the average was closer to 20,000. So how do we reframe the conversation some?
I think it goes back to the rule of thumb that we use, which is don't borrow more than your expected first year earnings. And so if, kind of looking at college graduates writ large, if first year post-graduation earnings are somewhere, in the order of magnitude of 40, 50K, and that's the amount of debt that most kids should be taking as a maximum, right? And then, the numbers bear that out. The average student debt is, in the order of magnitude of 30, 40K, right? Which would be below, and thus in that acceptable range of student debt that you could expect to be able to repay, with a typical job requiring a bachelor's degree. So I think that that's probably the narrative, is to say, hey, most people are taking out an appropriate amount of debt that they'll most likely be able to repay if they get a typical job for a bachelor's graduate. Obviously, there's a wide variance though, and the way that the news works is the front page news usually isn't a mundane story about what happens most of the time. The front page news is a unique story about something that only happened just this one unusual time, right? And so folks see these stories, like you say, of the medical student who took out $250,000 in student debt. The article also probably doesn't say that doctor is now making $300,000 a year, right? And by the way, that's whose debt would be forgiven in many, depending on how, this proposed legislation might work with the Biden administration.
Yeah. Another good one here. What are some resources that people can use, and whether that's websites or accounts to follow on different social, to keep up with affordability and costs, and how do we keep track of all the changes?
Well, so I'm Nick Ducoff on Twitter. My last name is spelled Ducoff, and I have two lists that you can follow where I've been kind of curating folks to follow. I think one is higher ed innovators, and the second is kind of smart student loan people or something like that. So they're kind of segregated between folks that generally talk about like the financial piece, and others that talk about like the higher ed innovation piece.
Great. And we'll put a link to that as well, so that if people are scrambling trying to write that down or search for it, we'll go straight there. Last question here, sort of a parting thought. What's one piece of advice that someone could take away and pass on to a student or family?
Who is that someone?
So whether they're an admissions counselor or an independent counselor, what should they pass along?
That the vast majority of time, college is a great investment. Depending on the way you look at it, the wage premium is as much as $1 million or more than a high school graduate without a college degree. That translates to about 14% annualized over the course of a career. That's 2 times the stock market return. So, there are just not that many investment classes that you can, invest in and make that kind of expected return. College is typically a great investment. So kind of try not to, get caught up in all the noise, and do your homework. And if you do your homework and make a smart college choice, it can change your life.
That's a great way to end. Well, thank you, Nick. I really appreciate your time. This was a great conversation, and I appreciate all your insights.
Thanks, Will, and thanks everyone for joining today.